Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I still have too much free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Today's ink I actually only had in sample form, but has lived in this fine Platinum Preppy since I got it, is Noodler's Bad Blue Heron. It's part of their Warden series, so it has particular special properties, so I made a slight adjustment to some of my tests for fun. The Warden series, generally reading the label off of a different bottle, says, the Warden's ink series resists the tools of the forger and is bulletproof, pH neutral, water-based, and resists UV light. So the alteration I made in the test is, on a little scribble in the corner, I left a drop of 1/3 bleach solution, which is what they tell you to get Bay State Blue out of your plastic pens. So let's take a look. Starting from the top down, Clairefontaine 90 grams per square meter. Here we have shading, which I hope comes through, because a lot of these more, resisty inks, a lot of times they come out kind of flat. Here there is kind of a matte finish, is the only way I can think to describe it. It's not shiny, it's not a very... the only word I have for it is matte. But I actually kind of like it. It's almost like a woolly texture. But there's shading. And the flow was pretty wet in the pen, considering it's a fine point and it's a preppy and those do run a little dry. So I felt it was a bit on the wet side. Dry time was 11 seconds, which, all things considered, I thought was fairly impressive on this dense paper. Look at this water test. I mean, you almost can't tell that there was a water test at all. And this was probably only dry for about 15 minutes. And then here in this little scribble, you might be able to see, just sort of in the center where it's a bit lighter, that's where I put the drop of the 1/3 bleach solution. So you can tell that something was put there, but it's a very different color ink. So you can tell that they tried to do something, but the ink is still there. It's very much intact. In fact, it's almost as intact as the rest of the ink. It's just sort of slightly changed color a bit. So I found that to be pretty impressive. Move those out of the way. Next is Rhodia, which is 80 grams per square meter. And again, I thought it did very well. Oddly, the dry time was the same, considering it's a slightly less dense paper. However, this one I feel has a coating on it that's a little more noticeable, but anyways, still shades, which I thought was great. Flow was still a tad on the wet side, which I was perfectly fine with, and still kind of has that matte finish, but again, I'm kind of warming up to that considering how well this is done. Now, I do say that there is some ghosting, which is sort of when you see through the other side. Now, I'm very picky, and yet this would not bother me, although I know some people are a little sensitive to it. As you can see when the light hits it, that's not that bad. And then down here was the bleach test, so I don't know how fair that is, unless you guys, dunk your notebooks in a bleach solution, which I don't know why you would do that. But again, great water test. Again, bleach test did very well. Here, it seemed to lift off a bit more, but again, its ink is still very much there, and it's changed color, but still, you didn't get rid of it. And actually the paper, maybe it'll pick it up on camera, but the paper started to come apart. So yeah, that bleach is going to tear apart the paper before it gets the ink out of the paper fibers, so it's doing its job. Here's Tomoe River Paper, which did have a longer dry time. However, here that matte finish very much went away. It sort of had a much clearer, sort of shiny look to it. It's not sheen, but it's, I don't know, it's a little more glassy. And you had great shading, just absolutely fantastic shading. I actually really liked it on this paper. And seemed to brighten up the color a little bit, which might be the cream quality of the paper, or might just be the qualities of the paper that prevent bleed, feather, and spread, because there was none of that. There is some ghosting because it is a very thin paper. Not enough to bother me, but again, it can bother some people. Great water test. It did put a little color on the paper nearby, but really not much. I mean, there's very little difference between this writing and this writing, which is very impressive. Here was the most significant bleach test. But again, the paper started to come apart. So listen to this compared to this. Yeah, it's doing its work. It's definitely proving itself to me. I'm very impressed with this ink. Here's 20-pound copy paper. Took 7 seconds to dry, which can be a bit long for this absorbent to paper, but it still has shading, and it's still a very bold color. A lot of times the absorbent papers sort of take some of the vibrancy out of the ink, but here it really didn't do that. Here it's still a very solid blue, and you know, with this being a well, I feel like blue as a category, it just ends up becoming one of those inks where people associate it with business, and since this is a Warden series ink and so it has very special staying properties, I think this would be a fantastic workhorse for the workroom ink. Again, great water test, very well behaved, no bleed, feather, or spread. That's because I put the piece of paper down on something. Please ignore that. And even the bleach test and the water test, there was no show through. Here, there was some effect, but again, like, the paper started to come apart, so it's definitely doing its job. In order to get this ink off this page, you got to get the page off the page. So it's going well. Now here's Mead Notebook Paper. Here it did start to get flattened. It definitely had that matte finish again, sort of like a woolly texture almost. There was some bleed, but on a sliding scale, it wasn't terrible. I mean, look, this whole middle section, there's barely any bleeding, which, I mean, for this paper, I find fairly impressive. Also, when you consider that this was a fairly wet writing ink, at least in my experience. Dry time was 1.5 seconds. I mean, it was almost instant, so that was great. I loved that. Maybe in a super extra fine nib or something, maybe this would be a fantastic combination. Just because in a fine nib it did really well, maybe in an extra fine nib. It did lose all the shading, and it did get that woolly finish, but if you're into that, this is great. Great water test. The paper was affected, but the ink is all there. The bleach test, again, the paper started to come apart and actually started to dye the other side of the page. So if somebody tried to use bleach to get this stuff off of this paper, they would have made a mess and ruined any chances they had to, I don't know, destroy or alter whatever was on there. Lastly is Moleskin notebook paper. I say that the bleed is comparatively minimal because it is. That's really not bad for Moleskin paper. I was actually kind of impressed with that. And it's more extreme show through because it's not quite reaching the other side of the page. It's definitely seeped in there pretty good into the fibers, but it's not quite reaching the other side, which you can tell because the water test didn't fully render through. So that's actually pretty impressive. However, it did soak so deep into the fibers of the paper that when it comes to show through, it is pretty noticeable. Now, 5-second dry time, not the fastest out there, but you know, it was okay. No shading, definitely had that woolly finish. It lost some of the vibrancy. It would not be my ideal combo. But I gotta say, just because of the bleed, definitely worth considering. And I rarely say that for Moleskin paper just because it's so troublesome. So That is Noodler's Warden series Bad Blue Heron with its special properties. And sorry for the long review, but there were some extra tests to be done. Let me know what you think. Share your own experiences, your own opinions. Just all I ask is that you be polite. And hopefully I'll see you again soon on the Triple N Network. So long.